2, 1. Liftoff. We have liftoff.
When it's my life on the line, what type of a team do I want out there holding it in their palm? And the answer I came to is, I think, the identical answer you would come to in the identical circumstance. When your life is on the line, you're going to want a team that's the best holding it in their palm. And how do teams get to be the best? They get there by practicing fundamentals, by doing little things consistently and religiously day in and day out until they become as natural as breathing. You don't even think about them. Now, there's lots of fundamentals out there, but there are three that I think have overarching importance to the success and safety of all teams everywhere, and those are the three that I want to talk about this morning. When I'm involved with any team, but particularly when there are lethal consequences associated with the team environment, as there are with you in firefighting and emergency response, just as it is in the space program. People die when they don't understand the dangers of a normalization of deviance and protect themselves against that. And I'm going to talk about that. I'll define that here for you in just a moment. I want everybody on the team understanding the essence of responsibility as it applies to the individual as well as it applies to the leadership. And I want a team that's filled with courageous self-leaders. I think Harold really kind of hit on that in his earlier comments. It's self-leadership that determines how safe and successful you can be. It's looking deep inside yourself. It has to be everybody practicing self-leadership for the team to succeed. It can't be 99 out of 100. Every individual, again, particularly in hazardous environments, has to be a courageous self-leader. So I'll talk about that as part of this teamwork program. Now, I'm going to use some experiences I had both as an Air Force flyer and as a NASA astronaut to develop some points on these fundamentals. And sadly, NASA provides me with two great tragedies to draw from to make some points. Those tragedies being the Challenger disaster and the Columbia disaster. Now, Columbia occurred 4 years ago. I think everybody's kind of familiar with that disaster. During launch, some foam came off the gas tank, damaged the heat shield. 2 weeks later, Columbia burned up on reentry, killing 7 astronauts. People are probably familiar with that disaster, whereas Challenger goes back 21 years ago this past January. Long time in the past. So I imagine most of you are probably foggy in your memories what caused the Challenger to be lost. And because I will be referencing that program, referencing that disaster in this program, I want to take a moment to briefly review for you mechanically what caused the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Challenger was a failure of the right-hand solid rocket booster. These things are so big, they're 150 feet long, 12 feet in diameter, and each of them weighs 1.3 million pounds. They're too big to be made in one piece at the factory in Utah and shipped in one piece down to Florida, where they're launched. So they build them in 4 propellant-filled pieces that are shipped separately by flatbed rail car from the Thiokol plant in Utah down to the vertical assembly building at Cape Kennedy. There, these segments are stacked on top of each other to form twin towers of boosters. The gas tank is hung between the boosters. The wing vehicle is attached to the gas tank, and then all of this is taken out to the launch pad on this 9 million pound mobile launch platform. Now, when these boosters ignite, they burn at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and at a pressure of about 1,000 psi. Steel boils at 5,000 degrees. So you have to ensure in your design that the steel of the booster is never touched by the fire that it contains. So there's insulating material to run the inside length of these segments. The obvious weak point in this design is where you've bolted these segments together, because there you have a potential leak path for the gas to pass to the outside, melt the steel, and cause a catastrophe. Now, I'm not going to go into the engineering specifics of the joint design that was intended to prevent such gas leakage, other than to say it was based on a redundant flexible O-ring scheme. 2 flexible O-rings. Here's a piece of one of them right here. 12 foot in diameter at each perimeter of those segment joints. 2 of them at each joint were supposed to form a redundant steel-to-steel pressure seal to prevent the fire from leaking out. On Challenger, both O-rings failed on the bottom segment of the right side solid rocket booster. Here's Challenger coming off the launch pad. In that yellow area, you'll see a black smoke being ejected. That's the vaporized O-rings being shoved out that bottom joint. You now have 5,000 degrees eating into that outer wall. As the rocket flies higher, the gas is vaporizing a bigger and bigger hole in the side of the booster rocket. 73 seconds into flight, the rocket comes apart, killing the 7 astronauts. Now, what you're seeing here appears to be an explosion, but was not. This was a catastrophic structural breakup. The fire weakened the attachment to the bottom of the gas tank, that bottom just basically fell off. The top of the booster rotated into the top of the gas tank, rupturing that, and under the aerodynamic and G-loads of the moment, the vehicle just shredded itself. Nothing detonated, nothing blew up. That will become important to remember downstream when we talk about crew survivability associated with this tragedy. Now, you're going to need that background to understand some of my downstream comments, and certainly you're going to need it to understand my comments about normalization of deviance. What is this? Well, it's that natural human tendency, particularly in pressure circumstances, to want to take shortcuts, to accept a lower standard of performance. Maybe it's a lower standard of personal performance, a lower standard of performance for some team you lead, lower standard of performance for some machine firefighting equipment that you oversee. But it's very human to find yourself in pressure circumstances, and God knows you folks find it on every call. Very human to find yourself in a pressure circumstance and rationalize, I can't execute to meet these standards I've been trained to meet. I'm going to have to take a shortcut. Maybe the shortcut is what Harold was talking about, not doing a proper risk assessment. Maybe it's not having the right communication in place. Maybe it's not wearing the right protective equipment, whatever. But it's very human in pressure to rationalize, I can't do this job and meet the standards. I'm going to have to take a shortcut. And so you take that shortcut, and guess what the consequences are? There are no bad consequences. You aren't injured. Nobody's injured. The emergency response proceeds successfully. There are no bad consequences to your actions in taking that shortcut. What's that going to do? It's going to loop it back into your brain and reinforce the rightness of that earlier decision to take the shortcut in the first place. So what's liable to happen the very next time you find yourself in these same pressure circumstances? And I guarantee there's going to be a next time, particularly in your businesses. Because there were no bad consequences the last time you took the shortcut, you're going to be mightily tempted to do it again. You do it enough times, and what happens? The shortcut becomes the norm. Here are the standards that you're expected to be meeting. Here's where you are in execution. This deviance is invisible to you. You don't even think about it. It has become normalized into your actions, into your team actions. And what happens with normalization of deviance, it leads to predictable surprises. And if you ever want, and I'll tell you, in hazardous environments, predictable surprises on the job can be injurious and they can be deadly. If you ever want an object lesson in what normalization of deviance can do, a predictable surprise, look at Challenger. Challenger was no accident. Challenger was a predictable surprise. At the time that rocket came apart, scattered throughout NASA under contractors and filing cabinets and desk drawers were written documents, memos, predicting that the exact thing that did happen, i.e. failure of this O-ring, was going to happen. And where did people get the information to make such predictions? From the best source available, flight data. It doesn't get any better than to get the piece back and see how it performed. And that's the case with these solid rocket boosters. They're not throwaway items. 25 miles up, they burn out, they're jettisoned, they have gigantic parachutes that are deployed. These things are lowered into the water. Air is trapped inside them when they hit, so they float. Tugboats are positioned out there to put a line on them, tow them back to shore. There they're cleaned up, taken apart, inspected, and used over again. The operative word in this process is inspected. And on 14 of 24 flights before Challenger, Challenger was number 25. On 14 of 24 flights before Challenger, in the inspection process, quality assurance and safety people noted that the O-rings, which were never designed to be touched by fire, were being touched by fire. And they understood the ramifications of their findings. This design is flawed. It's going to fail. People are going to die. And they basically put words to that effect in these various memos. I want to share with you excerpts of two of these memos, both of which were written by Thiokol engineers, the contractor, to their customer, NASA. The first memo is dated February of '84. This is 2 years before Challenger. And in part, the memo reads, the recent experience of two burned O-rings on STS-11, that's the 11th shuttle mission, raises concerns with STS-13. You know, when I read this, I wonder how come nobody was concerned about STS-12, my first mission. But apparently they weren't. The O-ring leak check procedure is also an urgent concern. Your support in this urgent matter is requested. 2 years before Challenger, the label urgent has been hung on this O-ring design. It's not working. Here's a sentence out of a Thiokol memo dated July of '85. This is 6 months before Challenger. The memo was written by Mr. Roger Bougielet, a Thiokol rocket engineer. In his memo, he wrote a very prophetic sentence. Here it is. It is my honest and very real fear that if we do not take immediate action to dedicate a team to solve the problem with the field joint, and that's the O-ring, having the #1 priority, then we stand in jeopardy of losing a flight, a crew, and all the launch pad facilities. Mr. Bourgelat's prediction was only off 73 seconds. He thought the rocket was going to blow up on the launch pad, destroy the vehicle, kill the crew, and take out the launch pad facilities. He missed it by 73 seconds. Challenger was no accident. Challenger was a predictable surprise. Now, I know what everybody's thinking right now. Why didn't the team react to these warnings, ground the fleet, and fix the problem? And the answer is, to a significant degree, the team was laboring under a long-term normalization of deviance. And let me explain. Approximately a decade before Challenger, a standard of performance was established for these O-rings in our failure modes and effects analysis document. They were given a criticality 1 label, meaning if they ever fail, it's loss of the vehicle and death to the crew. So a standard of performance was established for these O-rings. They can never show any hint of a failure mode. If they fail, it's death. And de facto, you have now established a standard of performance on how the team should react if they ever see a problem with the O-rings. Criticality 1 deviance, only one thing you can do, ground the fleet. But that standard of performance was established, as I said, about a decade before Challenger in a no-pressure situation. Emphasis on those words. When the first O-ring damage is seen, it's not a no-pressure situation. First O-ring damage is seen when they get the boosters back from the second shuttle mission. Now here you have leadership, quality assurance, safety people staring at their worst nightmare, evidence of a major design flaw in this multi-billion-dollar program. And they can see how the standard of performance has been violated. This is a criticality 1 deviance we're looking at, a burned O-ring. And at that point, the standard for the team was what? Ground the fleet. You cannot fly with a criticality 1 deviance. But the team could not bring themselves to adhere to that standard of performance established those many years earlier. Why? Because it's not a no-pressure situation. These people are under tremendous pressure, not just to see the fleet continue to fly, but to rapidly expand the shuttle flight rate. It's laughable now to hear, folks, but you know where we were headed in the early 80s with the shuttle flight rate? 26 missions a year. A shuttle was going to be flying every 2 weeks. And in fact, the shuttle made no economic sense if it wasn't flying at that flight rate. NASA had promised Congress and the American public the shuttle would dramatically reduce the cost of operating in space because it was going to be so easy to turn between missions. It would just take a couple weeks from landing to get it back on the launch pad with new boosters, new gas tank, new payload, and it's ready to go again. And that business model, 26 missions a year, became our God. Nothing could get in the way of that schedule. So now the team is facing a criticality 1 deviance. They have a standard of performance that they're supposed to adhere to, ground the fleet. But under this tremendous pressure, they start rationalizing why they can continue to fly or how to take a shortcut to accept a lower standard of performance. What they do is they take a pristine O-ring. They intentionally damage it to a degree greater than what they saw in the damaged recovered O-ring. They put that intentionally damaged O-ring in a laboratory pressure test article. They pressurized it to 3,000 psi, 3 times the pressure it ever see in flight, and that damaged O-ring held pressure. So the team rationalized, hey, even a damaged O-ring is holding pressure, and in flight the backup O-ring held pressure, so we don't need to ground the fleet. We can make some minor assembly processes and hope that fixes the problem, collect some data on the fly. We can continue flight operations in spite of a criticality 1 deviance. So they take the shortcut. And while I'm telling this story, I hope all of you are thinking about how many times you have rationalized. We're all human. We all come under pressure. How many times have you rationalized it's okay to take the shortcut? So now here the NASA team has rationalized it's okay to take the shortcut. You know, what they've done here now is accepted something that was never expected. It wasn't that the O-rings were designed to take damage and continue to function. They were never to see damage. But in this pressure cooker, the team has rationalized why it's okay to see some damage, something that's not expected and not understood. And flight operations continue. And guess what the consequences are? There are no bad consequences. The next couple missions return pristine O-ring, boosters that show pristine O-rings. And every time they break apart one of those boosters, see those perfect O-rings, what's that doing? Looping back into the brains of the NASA team it was okay to take the shortcut in the first place. Then they get the boosters back from the 6th shuttle mission. They see more damaged O-rings. What happens now? We're deeper into the program. The expectations are higher. The promises have been made are greater. Harder now to go back to that original standard of performance that says ground the fleet. And now they have that history of having gotten away with in the past. It becomes a little bit easier to rationalize why it's okay to continue flight operations again. So they make some more minor assembly process changes and continue flight operations. Basically what's happening here, folks, is the damage seen on Flight 2 is slowly becoming the umbrella. And the team slowly starts rationalizing, as long as we never see damage that exceeds what we saw on Flight 2, it's okay to continue flight operations. Well, for another dozen times or so, they get back boosters where the damage to the O-rings doesn't exceed what they saw on Flight 2, until on Flight 25, Challenger's mission, the damage exceeds in a great way what they saw on Flight 2. Total primary and backup O-ring failure, loss of the vehicle, and the death of 7 astronauts. Basically, by the time Challenger was occurring, a large body of the team that was working this O-ring problem had come to expect to see O-ring damage. Now, I want you to think about that. We'd gone from something we had correctly defined as intolerable to accept to something over 4 years and 24 missions has become what? Expected. Normalization of deviance. It is a killer of teams, folks. Literally, in hazardous environments, it will kill people. And now that we know what normalization of deviance is, I want to discuss how we protect ourselves against it. The first line of defense is recognizing our vulnerability. You're not any different than those engineers at NASA. We're all human. We all come under pressure on the job. We all get tempted to take the shortcut, to accept the lower standard of performance. So recognize your vulnerability. I just used, by the way, this NASA disaster to drive home what normalization of deviance is. But let's remember, it happens at an individual level, it happens at the smallest team levels, it happens in all industries. If you want an example, again, Harold touched on this, an example of normalization of deviance at the individual level, it's not latching a seatbelt. Why do people not latch a seatbelt? Because they've gotten away with it for 10, 20, 30, 50 years. They've driven and never needed it. That deviance is invisible to them. They've normalized it into their behavior. Do yourself a favor and your families a favor. You get in those vehicles, latch those seat belts. But we're all vulnerable, and that's the first line of defense. And another thing I'd implore all of you on these, you make multi-responses to emergencies. You can fall into the mode of believing you're so good. You're so good. You're bulletproof. And you got to recognize that's not true. There's no history being created. When you respond to an emergency out there and you successfully execute, there's no history being created in the laws of physics, the physics of death that you deal with. Fire, explosions, collapses, things like that. There's no history out there that's remembering how good you were the last time and is now going to cut you some slack the next time. It's up to you to recognize your vulnerability. First line of defense. Execute to meet standards. We have an expression in military aviation to protect us from normalization of deviance. It's called plan the flight, fly the plan. For you folks, it's plan the work, work the plan. Execute to meet standards. We have an expression in military aviation that the flight manual of a modern fighter is written in blood. It's very true, because there are people who have paid with their lives to learn some aspect of the operation of this vehicle, of this plane. And now that entry is in the plan to protect our lives. And it's exactly the same in your business. There's a huge memory out there of mistakes that have been made in the past that are incorporated now in your procedures. They are there to protect your lives. But it only works when you execute the plan. You meet those standards. Consider your instincts and the instincts of the people that you lead. Obviously, we have instincts for a reason, and sometimes they can be dead-on accurate. Obviously, from reading from these memos, there were a body of people, particularly at Thicol, that were not affected with this normalization of deviance phenomenon. Well, let me tell you what happened in the midnight hour, literally the midnight hour before Challenger was launched. Some of the authors of these same memos convened a special teleconference with their NASA counterparts and pleaded with them to call off Challenger's launch because the temperatures were going to be very cold, and the engineers rationalized these O-rings were going to get stiff, lose their flexibility to seal those joints when the boosters ignited. and a catastrophic leak could develop. So they pleaded with their counterparts at NASA to call off the launch until it got warmer. What was the response on NASA's end of that teleconference? They hammered these engineers. Show me the data! I can't call off a launch just because you don't feel good about it. Show me the data. We've launched in cold temperatures before, nothing bad's happened. Show me the data. They didn't have the data. It would have taken tens of millions of dollars offline testing to get the data. Instinctually, they had great fear what was going to happen if their product was used in these cold temperatures, but they had no hard data to support those instinctual fears, and their instinctual fears were dismissed out of hand. Don't do that, folks. We have instincts for a reason. If you're out there on one of these emergency responses and there's something nibbling at you, this just doesn't look right. Something is wrong here. Listen to that voice. Take a moment, stand back, and see if there isn't some data to support that instinctual concern. If you're in a team leadership position and your people are coming to you and say, hey, boss, this just doesn't look right. There's something here that just doesn't feel right. Listen. Take a moment, look, and see if there isn't some data to support that instinctual concern. Don't dismiss those instinctual concerns out of hand. Finally, I would make sure that everybody archives and reviews the near misses and disasters that have occurred on your teams and within your industry. And God knows there's lots of disasters out there to learn from, and Harold talked about a lot of them that you've recently had. But let's make sure we don't repeat the mistakes. Oh, you know, that's the greatest tragedy, when you see mistakes repeated. And somebody somewhere else in the industry has already paid with an injury or a death to learn something, and now it's repeated by some other part of the firefighting teams out there. Make certain that you archive and review the near misses and disasters that have occurred. New hires should be required to review them. Everybody should be required to review those lessons periodically. This, by the way, was not done at NASA. 17 years, this is the real tragedy of Challenger. 17 years later, it was all repeated. Normalization of deviance is what brought down Columbia. Now, what happened on Columbia is a piece of foam flew back, hit the left leading edge wing, which has a carbon panel on it. The wings and nose see 3,000 degree heat on reentry. They're protected with carbon panels. In tests that were done after Columbia, they fired some of this foam into panels of this carbon, and they blew holes in it. And that's what happened on Columbia. They had a 9-inch diameter hole on reentry. There was a pathway for 3,000 degree heat to enter into an aluminum vehicle that melts at 1,000 degrees. The left wing burned off, the vehicle tumbled out of control, broke up, and 7 more astronauts died. And what you're looking at here, folks, is another example of normalization of deviance at work. Here's a comment made by one of the Columbia board members. NASA had lived for 20 years with the idea that foam, the foam on the gas tank, could not cause a catastrophe. Foam appeared on lists of critical safety risks for every flight, but its defects were given a standing waiver. Normalization of deviance. The lessons of Challenger were forgotten. 7 more astronauts died 17 years later. So let's make sure we practice these fundamentals right here to guard ourselves against that normalization of deviance. We are all vulnerable in hazardous environments that can lead to injury and death. I want to talk about the fundamental of responsibility, and I want to introduce this topic by telling you a story from my Air Force flying career. I have to preface the story with this point. I was not an Air Force fighter pilot for this reason right here. My eyes were bad. I had to wear glasses. So I flew in the back seat of fighters, the F-4 Phantom mostly. If you saw the movie Top Gun, remember Tom Cruise was Maverick? His backseater's call sign was Goose. That's what I was. I was an Air Force Goose flying in the back of these F-4s. Now, I wasn't married to Meg Ryan like the Goose in the movie was, which, by the way, is her great loss, or so I would like to believe. Okay, the story I want to relate to you right now involves my very first flight in this airplane, the F-111. This has side-by-side seating. The Goose rides the right side of the pilot. I was making my first flight in this airplane, doing some weapons testing over the Gulf of Mexico. In the course of that weapons test, we reached a point called bingo fuel. Bingo fuel is a safety point. You calculate it before you ever take off. It's the fuel state at which you're supposed to stop the mission and fly home, because theoretically at bingo fuel you only have enough gas to do that. Safely cruise back to your base, attempt to land, not be able to land because the weather's bad, feels closed for some reason, and have to divert to another base maybe 100 miles away or so. So bingo fuel was a safety point. I knew that. I had 1,500 hours of goose time from the back of the F-4 that told me that. Now here I am on my first flight in this airplane staring at bingo fuel. I pointed out the pilot on my left, expecting him to fly home, but we had one more data point to get in this weapons test. And he said, looked at me and said, we can get this last data point. Okay. So we sailed past that safety point. I'll cut to the chase. The airplane that took off looking like this, and which cost us taxpayers tens of millions of dollars, ended the mission as this pile of wreckage on the Eglin Field runway. And I wish I could tell you there were some heroics involved here, but there weren't. We ran out of gas. And as the plane was crashing, I reached for the ejection handle and pulled it. On the F-111, that separates the entire cockpit. The crew remains inside. A parachute is catapulted out, and the cockpit is lowered to the ground. In our case, the ground was the runway. So we were close, but close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades. It doesn't count landing one of these jets. Now, what does this story have to do with responsibility? Well, I'll bet everybody here can see where I'm going with this story. I want everybody to come back into the cockpit with me at that moment in the flight where we reached bingo fuel. I pointed out that pilot on my left, expecting him to fly home, but instead he looked at me and said, we can get this last data point. And even though at that critical moment there was this little voice whispering in the back of my brain, oh, Mullane, this doesn't look right. We don't have a lot of gas. We're sucking it down in a big hurry. We're 70 miles out over the water, long way from home. The weather's bad back home. This doesn't look right. Say something. Put your perspective on the situation out there on the table for this guy to consider. But I didn't say a word. Basically, at this critical moment in this team operation, I ceased to be a team member and became what? A passenger. And why did I do it? Well, let me tell you, for the identical reason in your past lives, you've done the same thing. This is the original sin of teamwork. We're all guilty of it. You may not have done it in a long time, and hopefully you'll never do it again, but I guarantee each and every one of you can remember back in moments in your careers where you were seeing something. You were sitting in a meeting and hearing something. Maybe you had an idea, you had a concern, but just as I did in that F-111, you sat there mute. You didn't say a word. You became a passenger, and then years later, or maybe weeks, months, even years later, you regret it. Because now you can see that something bad happened out here that might not have happened had you maintained your team presence and put your idea or concern out on the table for the team and the leadership to consider those many weeks, months, and even years earlier. Why do we do this? And I'll tell you, it can happen in a heartbeat. We're going from effective team member, next moment, we're sitting there as passengers. There's lots of reasons, but here are some of the real whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. One of the major reasons is we end up in that mode of wanting to accept this group think. We'll sit there and go along with the flow with a group, whereas individually we would never agree to accept it. You know, we'd have, if somebody came to us individually and asked our opinion, we would have that opinion. We'd put it out there. But in a group, we don't want to deal with confrontation. It's easy to go with the flow. You know, that group think. That'll turn us into a passenger. We assume others are going to take action. We don't need to. We defer to people who have been in the organization longer and occupy loftier positions, rationalizing they have to know better than we. You know, that's what turned me into in that F-111, that's what turned me into a passenger. I was the goose. I had 30 minutes of flying time in this plane. The pilot to my left had 1,000 hours in it, and he was the aircraft commander. So I rationalized at that bingo fuel point that, hey, he's got to know what he's doing. He's got so much time in the plane. He is the aircraft commander. Surely he sees the situation more clearly than I. And so I deferred to him. Position and longevity. And disaster resulted. My near death, his near death, and the loss of that plane. These are just some of the reasons that we can slip into this passenger mode. And I tell you, when it happens, the team is jeopardized. If everybody is not on board with the team, if we have any passengers on the team is jeopardized. This right here is the irreducible essence of our responsibility as individuals on a team, right here, is making sure we count. We never slip into that passenger mode. The power of all teams, folks, resides in the individual. And I say that, it's the engine, the individual is the power of the team. And the reason I can say that is none of us are clones. We've had this diversity of life experience. And through this diversity of life experience, we bring a diversity of perspectives to team situations. You may have 99 people on a team, and because of their common life experience, they have a common perspective. And then you have one other individual who worked somewhere else, was on a different team, had a different boss, had something happen to them in their past lives that is now giving them a different perspective on the situation. And if they would maintain their team presence, put it out there for the team and the leadership to consider, it could have a measurable and significant impact on the safety and success of the team. But it only works when 100 out of 100 people are doing it, not 99 out of 100. Maintaining that team presence. And I would encourage everybody, when you talk about individual responsibility, to tattoo this quote on your brain. This is a quote by former U.S. President Andrew Jackson. One person with courage forms a majority. And that's very true. Another way people dismiss themselves into the passenger mode is assuming they don't count. The team's too big. You know, nobody's going to hear them. And they dismiss themselves into that passenger mode. Everybody counts, folks, because none of us are clones. And we all bring this diversity of life experience to the team that gives us this diversity of perspectives. So let's remember that. You count. I don't care if you've been on the job day one or if you're getting ready to retire after 30 years. You count because you are not replicated anywhere else on that team. And I would encourage leaders to make sure they lead with this philosophy, empowerment, to make sure in word and deed you're telling your teams, hey, I value you as an individual. I recognize your uniqueness, that you're not duplicated. If I'm going to lead this team and be in the safest and the most successful it can be, I have to climb into your brains and take a look around. I want to hear from you. That is a critical aspect of leadership, and that's empowerment, making sure nobody is allowed to slip into that passenger mode, that everybody counts. Okay, let's finish up this program now with a discussion on courageous self-leadership. And again, that goes back to what Harold was talking about in his opening comments about looking deep inside yourself and seeing, you know, have you become complacent? Can you change yourself? Can you be better as a team member and better as a team leader? That all goes back to courageous self-leadership. The success and safety that you enjoy is not through luck. It's not written in the stars. It's not destiny. Personal and professional success to a significant degree flows from courageous self-leadership. I hear all the time when I interview with the press and they hear my life story, and I'll tell you here in a moment how I turned out to be an astronaut, but when they hear that story, I look at the paper the next morning, the first sentence will read, it was destiny that Mike Mullane would be an astronaut. No! No! Destiny has nothing to do with personal and professional success. It's not written in the stars. Flows through courageous self-leadership. I'll prove to you that it wasn't destiny that made Mike Mullane an astronaut. This is what destiny had to work with right here. Teenage Mike Mullane. Trust me, you would not have wanted him knocking on your doors and dating your daughters. That put the fear of God in you. You know, a lot of people assume if I'm an astronaut now, destiny had genius to work with. Gosh, I have to have been a gifted genius child if I'm an astronaut now. Well, let's investigate that. Here's my high school yearbook photo. Down in ambition, it says to attend the Air Force Academy. I couldn't get into the Air Force Academy. My grades weren't good enough. West Point took me, which frankly doesn't say a lot about West Point. But in all fairness to West Point, I was a third alternate for my congressional district. I barely made it into West Point, and at graduation West Point, I wasn't on the stage getting any awards for academic excellence. Destiny did not have genius to work with. Let me show you a few other things that destiny struggled with. This is the varsity club in my high school, the star athletes in my high school. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not in this picture. Destiny didn't have athleticism to work with. See this lady? This is the homecoming queen. I didn't date the homecoming queen. Destiny didn't have good looks to work with. This next slide says it all, what destiny had in teenage Mike Mullane. The autographed pages out of my high school yearbook. It gets worse. It gets worse. I have one autograph, one. And you know what it reads? And I'm as serious as a heart attack. It reads, you missed Korea, but here's hoping you make Vietnam. That is the only autograph I have in my entire high school yearbook. Destiny did not have popularity to work with. Folks, I am not an astronaut because it was written in the stars, because it was destiny. And you have not led your teams to great success and safety. You, as an individual, have not achieved success and safety because it was destiny, because it was luck, because it was written in the stars. It's because you learned and practiced elements of courageous self-leadership. We all learn these lessons from many different sources. Parents are frequently a great source. Coaches, teachers, scoutmasters, co-workers, bosses. We learn these lessons, we apply them, and from that flows great success. And I learned my lessons, significant lessons, from my parents. My dad was a World War II aviator, met and married my mom when she was 18 in 1943. My dad survived the war, came back to live the American dream with my mom, but then in 1955, at age 33, my dad was crippled for life with polio. Never again walked, spent the rest of his life on crutches and braces and in a wheelchair. And at this time in my parents' lives, they had 6 children to raise. I'm number 2 in the birth order underneath that red arrow there. But you can imagine the horror of waking up one day and realizing the primary breadwinner in a family of 6 kids is now confined for life to a wheelchair at a time in America where impaired people were not highly valued. And this could have gone down real ugly. My father could have committed suicide, could have become a drug addict, my mom could have left him, but none of that happened because my parents were courageous self-leaders, and they reacted to adversity as courageous self-leaders do. They accepted what they could not change. They didn't throw up their hands and say, I quit, and had some of these bad things happen. They accepted what they could not change, and then to the degree possible, they made a mid-course correction around those obstacles. They stayed laser-focused on their goal. The goal was raising these 6 kids. And they worked around the obstacle as best as they could, hammering away at that goal, raising these 6 kids. And that's all characteristic of self-leadership, how you respond to adversity. I was only 9 years old when this was happening. I had no idea I was being imprinted with these lessons, but I can see now as an adult how I was imprinted with them and how they played out in turning me into an astronaut. Let me tell you that story. Early in my life, I wanted to fly as far back as I could remember. Here's a picture of me when I was about 4 years old, looking at a book about jet planes. There were no astronauts when I was this young, but there were jets. I wanted to grow up and fly them. As I did grow up, an amazing event happened in world history. October 4th, 1957, 50 years ago, what happened? Sputnik. The space race started. I was 12 years old. I was reborn on that date. I became a child of the space race, fell in love with everything associated with space, with rockets, with astronomy. I was growing up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and could indulge my interest in homemade rockets from the vast desert right outside my home door. And I was setting a goal, even this young, of someday riding a rocket into space, of being an astronaut. This is the first mark of self-leadership. We challenge ourselves in the extreme. We set very lofty goals for ourselves. There's a huge population that is here in their personal and professional lives, and now they're going to challenge themselves, and what do? They take a tiny little baby step. Why do they do that? They're safe. They know they can get here. Courageous self-leaders never do that. We know we can get here. What we don't know is, can we get out here? But we're going to find out. We're going to find out. We're going to reach deep down and see what we're capable of. It's really sad, the waste of potential in this world. These people behind us will go to their graves never knowing what they were truly capable of because they never challenged themselves. You can never know what you're capable of unless you challenge yourself. Think of it this way. We test military aviation, military planes, jets, to find the edge of their performance envelope. How high can they fly? How fast? How many G's they can pull? We all, individually, personally and professionally, have a performance envelope. But I'll tell you right now, it's a lot further out there than any of us think. Any of us, myself included. That performance envelope is way out there. The way we find it is by taking these big steps, these big challenges, reaching down, saying, hey, I can lead my team to a higher standard of safety. I can be safe. I can be a self-leader and influence the people around me to be self-leaders and make this team safer. I can do these things because I am a courageous self-leader. That is the first mark of self-leadership, is challenging yourself to ever higher and higher goals. And I certainly was doing that, as challenging myself to grow up and be an astronaut someday. As I said, I was testing these homemade rockets from the nearby deserts. Rockets? Not really. These things were pipe bombs with fins. It's amazing I didn't blow myself to hell and back with these things. Sometimes I needed a wind tunnel. I didn't have it, so I used my dad's car as a wind tunnel. If I saw this today, I'd dial 911. Sometimes I tested these things to the roof of my parents' house. A real dumb idea. The neighbors were sure happy to see me leave, and the fire department, I'm sure. Here I am setting up one of my creations for launch. Here I am legging it out after lighting a fuse. There's ignition, and there's detonation. I hear all the time, people hear I flew combat in Vietnam, flew 3 times on the space shuttle, and they say, wow, look at all that danger you lived in your life. Trust me, the most dangerous period of any male's life isn't whatever they do as an adult male. It's when they're a teenage boy. Because when you're a teenage boy, you don't have a brain in your head. And there's proof of it right there. Here's one of my successful launches. Here's one of my rockets parachuting back to the desert. Here I am recovering one of those rockets. I want to re-show this video. Note the young woman, about 18, 19 years old, walking off the screen to the right there. That is now my wife of 40 years. There's a woman who will never be able to say, I didn't know what I was getting into. Not when I have video like that. As you heard, I went to West Point, graduated West Point in 1967, went into the Air Force to be a pilot, test pilot, astronaut. Could not be a pilot because my eyes were bad. Ended up flying in the back seat of the F-4 Phantom, as I told you. Well, guess what? In 1967, if you couldn't be a pilot, you couldn't be an astronaut. End of dream, or so it would appear. But I can see I reacted to this news in a way that's characteristic of courageous self-leaders. I didn't throw up my hands and said, I quit. I had a goal. That goal was flying. My mid-course correction was, hey, if I can't fly in the front seat of the airplane, I'll fly as a goose in the back seat. If I can't be an astronaut, I'm going to get as close as I can. I'll work in mission control as a flight director, possibly. That's all characteristic of self-leaders, and that is encountering obstacles, and they're always there. Nobody ever has a straight shot for any personal professional goal. There's always obstacles. Do you throw up your hands and say, I quit, or you navigate around them as best as possible, stay laser focused on the goal, and continue? Two other things I was doing as an astronaut, excuse me, as an Air Force goose. I'll tell you how I ended up being an astronaut in a second, but two other things I was doing that are critical aspects of self-leadership. One is I went back to school and advanced my education, got a master's degree. Courageous self-leaders are never happy with their education. I'm not necessarily talking about formally advancing your education. I'm talking about an attitude, an open mind. I don't know everything, but I want to know everything. So you listen to other people. You'll go to company training or firefighting training opportunities. You'll read. You're sponges. Basically, you're always constantly trying to better yourself. Another thing we do is our best at everything. We pour heart and soul in the task at hand. We don't rationalize, when's this ever going to count? It always counts. Everything you're doing, everything you have ever done is going to count in your futures. So we constantly do our best at everything. For me, all of these characteristics came into play in a way I could not have imagined in 1967. 10 years later, 1977, the obstacle's removed. NASA changes the rules and says to be a mission specialist astronaut on the space shuttle, you don't have to be a pilot. Mission specialists are people that use a robot arm, do experiments, lift up satellites, things like that. You don't have to be a pilot to be a mission specialist. So all of a sudden that dream was back in front of me. I filled out an application. I sent it to NASA, and I was selecting the first group of shuttle astronauts 10 years after I thought that dream was over. Now let's summarize in text. And by the way, make sure you take this message back to your children on that do your best. For 10 years, I did my best as a goose, as an engineer, thinking it was never going to count toward being an astronaut because of my bad eyesight. It turned out it all counted. So all the children that you deal with, make sure they understand that. Everything they're doing in their life is going to count in their futures, just as it does for all of us. Okay, let's summarize in text here what we learned about self-leadership. How did it happen that a child with a goal of someday riding a rocket into space is 25 years later riding a rocket similar to this, passing 200 miles over that exact spot in the desert? Here's Albuquerque seen from space. How did that happen? It wasn't luck. It wasn't destiny. It happened because I learned these lessons in self-leadership and practice them. Self-leaders challenge themselves in the extreme, set very lofty goals. We accept those things we cannot change. We don't get bogged down or throw up our hands and say, I quit. We make mid-course corrections around the obstacles. We stay laser-focused on the goal. We constantly advance our education, and we constantly do our best. If I could distill into two sentences the philosophy of life by which courageous self-leaders live their lives, it's these two sentences right here. Success isn't some mythical final destination. It is a continuous life journey of challenging ourselves to ever higher and higher goals, searching for that edge of our performance envelopes as team leaders, as team members, parents, spouses, whatever. No courageous self-leader ever crosses the goal line, spikes the ball, says, game over, I won. Oh, we'll celebrate an accomplishment, but relatively quickly, we're going to say, hold it, I don't want to be here. I can lead this team to be safer. I can take them out here. I can lead myself to be safer and better. I can take myself out here. That's how it's done, finding that performance envelope. And I hope I just preached to the choir here. I hope you just all saw yourself in those characteristics. But please practice great self-leadership. Guard against that normalization of deviance. Leaders empower people. Don't allow them to slip into that passenger mode. And everybody remember, you count. Never fall in the passenger mode. Put your ideas, your concerns out there for the team and the leadership to consider. And when you do these things, you will take your teams to the highest achievable orbits of success and safety, as certainly as this rocket is taking her crew to new orbits. And I wish you Godspeed on that journey. Be safe. Bye-bye.